As you know, Israel is reeling right now
My
after
pleasure,
the
Wolf.
first part of your plan to weaken Israel's Supreme Court passed into law. We're already seeing very negative impacts on the Israeli military, relations with the United States, the economy. Startup companies are leaving Israel. The far right is emboldened. Palestinians are afraid. Protests certainly continue as well. Is that the price, Mr. Prime Minister, you're willing to pay for this overall?
Well, first of all, we're not trying to weaken the Supreme Court. We're trying to bring balance between the three branches of government, which is the essence of democracy. In Israel, over the last 20, 30 years, the Supreme Court arrogated a lot of the powers of the judiciary and the executive. They can basically nullify any decision made. That doesn't happen anywhere on the planet. And so we're trying to bring it back in line. And we don't want a subservient court. We want an independent court, but not an all-powerful court. And that's what the corrections that we're doing. I think a lot of the things that you described are in the choir. People are saying it, they're giving indications, but I've been there before. When I made these huge changes in our economy, they said, oh, we'll bring down the economy. Israel has become a juggernaut since. When I spoke out against Iran, against the entire world,
Mr. Prime Minister, let me interrupt with all due respect.
People see it differently now.
Mr. Prime Minister, let me interrupt with all due respect. You, of course, control the executive in Israel. Your coalition controls the Knesset, the parliament. You're weakening the Supreme Court. Where are the checks and balances? Well,
in Israel, we have the Supreme Court has a lot of checks, but there are no balances. For example, on the on the decision that we passed on reasonableness, understand what that is. It's like the court can nullify a decision, any decision by the government, by the executive, by saying it's unreasonable, not because it's illegal, not because they're using other checks that they have, plenty of things that they could do. They can nullify an appointment. It's like the Supreme Court would be able to nullify an appointment by President Biden, not by saying that there's a conflict of interest, that exists today in Israel, that it's undue process, that exists today in Israel, that it's not proportional, that exists in Israel, but just by saying, we don't think this appointment is reasonable. That doesn't exist in America. It doesn't exist in most democracies, not to this scope. And that's the minor correction that we made that is now called the end of democracy. If that's the end of democracy, there are no democracies because none of them have this. So I think there's a lot of hype.
Mr. Prime Minister,
there's a lot of concern. A lot of it is concern.
The U.S. has a lot more checks
Wolf,
and balances.
You're asking me to come here.
Yeah. Let me just point out, the U.S. has a lot more checks and balances. And as you know, what's so disturbing is that thousands of Israeli military reservists are protesting, including pilots. They're refusing to serve right now. That's emboldening Israel's adversaries like Iran. They're watching. Is Israel less safe today because of what you're doing?
Well, I'll answer it if you let me answer your questions. If you just want to hear yourself, go ahead. But if you want to hear my answer, let me answer.
Go ahead.
Israel has a very strong military. It has a very strong military. It is able to deal with all the challenges that we have, and we have many. But I want to tell you one thing. You speak of a few thousand who've expressed their reservations, their opposition. Israel has an army of hundreds of thousands with reservists. We had close to 100,000 people who signed a petition to say that we support the current actions of the government. You didn't hear a word about it. We had 250,000 people the other day in Tel Aviv supporting the government. You didn't hear a word about it. Yes, there is a big debate, and some of the former generals are leading an effort against this reform. That's okay. It's a legitimate thing. But in a democracy, the day that that former generals can force the elected officials, democratically elected officials, to stop legislation on this or that matter, I would say that's the day that Israel really stops being a democracy. Yes, we have now a big debate. I don't want to minimize it. I also don't want to minimize the concerns that people have because many of them have been caught in this spiral of fear. It's not going to happen. Israel is going to remain a democracy. There are checks and balances. We have to bring some of the Israeli judiciary, some of it back to a center where it will be like most democracies. That's not going to end democracy. It's not going to weaken democracy. It's going to strengthen democracy.
Let me get your.
And you're going to see that very soon.
Let me get your sense on some specifics, Mr. Prime Minister. Can you promise this new law won't be used to fire Israel's Attorney General, who, of course, is overseeing your corruption trial?
Well, first of all, there's no connection between my trial and this reform that is the product of millions of Israelis saying that that people have taken away their democratic decisions, and that they don't decide anything, but 15 unelected officials, judges, respectable judges, they decide everything. That's not what they want. As far as my trial is concerned, it's been going on for 3 years. It's unraveling. 2-3 weeks ago, the judges called in the prosecution and said, listen, drop the corruption, not the corruption, drop the bribery charge, which is really the lead charge. And they haven't even heard a single witness for the defense. The only thing I want for my trial is live coverage of TV. That's enough, because I've always said the truth will come out in this judicial process, and it will. As far as the Attorney General is concerned, and you asked that, I can't even deal with that. I'm not able to deal with it. But I can tell you that this is not going to happen, because it needs the heads of all the coalition to agree to it, and they're not going to agree to it. It's not happening.
Do you expect to face any serious consequences from the United States, Mr. Prime Minister, for ignoring President Biden's repeated warnings against pushing through this overhaul?
I respect President Biden. I know he's been a great friend of Israel and a friend of mine for 40 years. We can have our disagreements. And look, Wolf, I've been serving as Prime Minister for 16 years. That's a long time. During those 16 years, I've watched other democracies in France, the U.S., and elsewhere. They have the same debates about the power of the Supreme Court, the power of the executive. They have riots, they have demonstrations and protests. I've declined to comment on that. I've never commented, ever, on what happens in the internal processes of democracies. Elected leaders and other democracies can comment on Israel. Everybody wants to comment on Israel. That's fine, they can do it. But ultimately, the decisions are made in our democratic institutions, and I think they'll be made in a measured way, just as we've done now. We've trimmed this reform. Let's tell the truth. We've trimmed it. We've listened to the concerns of the opposition and the broad spectrum of the public. I think they're wrong in a lot of things, but I think they have points, important points. So we trimmed it down to a minor thing on reasonableness. We're trying now to achieve, I gave a push the pause button on the legislation in which I had a majority. For 3 months, tried to negotiate with the opposition. They wouldn't agree to anything, even a minor change. But I'm not giving up. And I think the fact that we won this particular round, I think maybe gives us the opportunity, when they see that we have a majority to legislate without them, maybe we'll be able to legislate with them. I'm actually hopeful that we can reach this compromise.
As a result of what you're doing, Mr. Prime Minister, the Biden administration has said, and this was very blunt, you're not invited to come to the White House. They say you'll meet President Biden in the fall somewhere else in the United States. Isn't that a very significant sign that U.S.-Israel relations right now are suffering big time because of your policies?
Well, first of all, President Biden spoke to me the other day, and he said specifically that he's inviting me to the White House.
If one wants to help Israel, then the President of the United States has to say publicly, explicitly, officially, that America is reassessing its relations with the State of Israel on all matters, on economic matters, on foreign aid, on everything.
That's pretty incredible when you think about a former Israeli prime minister, and I've covered Israel for many years, saying something like that. What's your reaction to what Prime Minister Olmert said?
Well, it may explain why Prime Minister Olmert was booted out by the electorate, why he had 6% support. That's why, because you're quite right. A Prime Minister of Israel does not say that. He doesn't call on other nations to and especially our great friend, the United States, to turn its back to Israel. Israel is a democratic country. It has an internal debate. You have an internal debate in the United States right now about the powers of the Supreme Court, about whether it's abusing its power, whether you should curtail it. I'm not going to enter into that debate. Does that make the American democracy not a democracy? Does that make that debate unworthy? Does that make that issue a symbol of the fact that you're moving to some dictatorship? Of course not. So this is a bitter politician who failed and was rejected by the voters, coming back and saying, "Oh well, I'm going to get mine back." Sorry, that's not the right way to act. You're quite right. It is an amazing spectacle, and I think it just tells you who these people are.
Let me get your reaction to what's going on here in the United States on one specific issue. How are you watching, Mr. Prime Minister, the former President Donald Trump's ongoing legal troubles here in the U.S.?
You know, we have enough in our politics. I'm not going to enter yours.
So no comment from you on that.
I told you that I have declined commentary on American internal politics as long as I can remember, and I don't intend to change that now.
Looking ahead to September, when Israel's Supreme Court will hear appeals to this new law, if the court does strike this down, will you abide by that ruling?
Well, look, we'll go into uncharted territory, and I really would like to believe that they won't do that. And the reason is that, first of all, we're all subject to the rule of law. The Prime Minister is subject to the rule of law. The Knesset, our parliament, is subject to the rule of law. The judges are subject to the law. Everybody is subject to the law. Now, the closest thing we have to a constitution are basic laws. That's what we're dealing with. And what you're talking about is a situation, a potential situation, where in American terms, the United States Supreme Court would take a constitutional amendment and say that it's unconstitutional. That's the kind of the kind of spiral that you're talking about, and I hope we don't get to that.
We have a lot to discuss, and we're going to continue this conversation. But let me get your thoughts on what happened on Sunday. You had surgery, Mr. Prime Minister, to implant a pacemaker to address a transient heart block, a condition doctors have known about for years. First of all, how are you feeling?
Well, I feel fine. Yeah, I can tell you that. And more eager to advance things, to advance the cause of security, stability, and peace than ever before. One of my aides said, well, you're now, having done the Abraham Accords, you're now the peacemaker with a pacemaker. Well, if that induces me to accelerate the pace of pursuing the broad peace in the Middle East, all for the better. But thank you for your question and for your concern.